Hello, my name is Alan Singer. I'm a former New York City high school teacher. I am currently a teacher educator and historian at Hofstra University. I've been a member of the New Jersey Council for the Social Studies for over 20 years. I previously edited Social Science Docket. I now assist in editing Teaching Social Studies. I'm going to talk with you today about how to approach racist text and imagery from the past when they are part of units in both American and world history. On May 2nd, 2021, the New York Times published an opinion essay, How the N-Word Became Unsayable. The essay was by John Warder, an associate professor of linguistics at Columbia University. In the essay, which was adopted from his book, 9 Nasty Words, English in the Gutter, McWhorter, who was African American, traced the history of the N-word, and he used it freely in the text. McWhorter argues that the N-word evolved from being a more or less neutral descriptor in the 16th century to being a nasty pejorative in the 20th century and a taboo phrase at the start of the 21st century. In an accompanying essay, 2 New York Times editors explained why the newspaper decided to publish the essay, and in McWhorter essay include the offending slur. However, in their essay, they write N-word, not the slur itself. As a high school teacher and now as a university-based teacher, educator, and historian, and as a white man, often teaching in classrooms where students were predominantly African American, I have always taken a careful approach to the examination of racist language and racist imagery when teaching about America's racist and nativist past. Sometimes I edit out language while alerting students to the edits. Other times I discuss the issue with students and let the class decide if they wanted to examine the original text or an edited alternative. We did not read racist language aloud. My thought with both the text and images was I wanted students to understand the depth and power of racism in American society. This was never about what's called now cancel culture. I want students to understand there's a lot of implicit and explicit racism in important American documents starting in the colonial era. The colonial laws of New York encoded enslavement in 1702 when the General Assembly dictated that, quote, no person or persons hereafter throughout this province do presume to trade with any slave, either in buying or selling, without leave or consent of the master or mistress, end quote. And in 1711, the Common Council of the City of New York established a place for the sale and rent of enslaved Africans at the Wall Street Slip. Starting in 1742, the New York City Common Council approved a series of regulations to severely restrict the freedom of movement of enslaved Africans in the city. The Declaration of Independence, which was primarily written by Thomas Jefferson, accused the King of Great Britain of exciting, quote, domestic insurrections amongst us, close quote, in response to the 1775 proclamation by Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia colony, declaring that, quote, all indentured servants, Negroes of others, appertaining to rebels, free, that are able and willing to bear arms. So the British were prepared to free enslaved Africans who rose up against the colonists and slavery. The Virginia Assembly responded, quote, that all Negro other slaves conspiring to rebel or make insurrection shall suffer death, close quote. While the Declaration famously declared that all men are created equal, in Notes on the State of Virginia, written in 1785, Thomas Jefferson, who spent the majority of his adult life in a sexual relationship with an enslaved African woman, argued that whites had, quote, superior beauty, close quote, smelled better, and could reason more effectively than blacks. The Constitution of the United States never explicitly mentioned slavery prior to the passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865 that ended slavery, but it recognized and endorsed slavery in a number of its clauses. Article 1, Section 2, Paragraph 3, based taxation and representation on the, quote, the whole number of free persons plus 3/5 of all other persons. Article 1, Section 9, Clause 1, declares that Congress shall not prohibit prior to 1808, quote, importation of such persons as any state now existing shall admit to be proper, close quote. Article 4, Section 2, Clause 3, demands the return of any person, quote, held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof, escaping into another, close quote. In his 1841 argument before the Supreme Court in the Amistad case, former President John Quincy Adams, who was an abolitionist, referred to the explicit omission of slavery in the Constitution as, quote, the fig leaves under which the parts of the body politic are decently concealed, end quote. In Lessons on the Oppression of African Americans and Other Groups, I try to counter the sense of victimization with a focus on resistance. We look at slave rebellions, runaways, Underground Railroad conductors, vigilance committees, speeches by Henry Highland Garnett and Sojourner Truth, the writings of Frederick Douglass, Williams Wells Brown, Solomon Northup. In the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, published in 1845, Douglass includes the offensive word 11 times when quoting slaveholders and racist whites. The word appeared 25 times in the expanded 1892 iteration of Douglass's biography, including in the lyrics of a song sung by enslaved Africans. William Wells Brown and Solomon Northup used the word in a similar fashion in their narratives. As a high school teacher, I established that certain language is not permissible in class, especially language that insulted or diminished other people, either as individuals or as members of a group. When we arrived at the women's rights movement in the 1840s and 1850s, I introduced a problem. Sojourner Truth, an African-American woman, an abolitionist, a women's rights advocate, and a former slave, in one of the more important speeches of the 19th century, referred to herself using a word we'd established could not be used in class. I had students decide whether to read an original version of the speech, where she spoke in dialect, a version where the offending word was removed, or in an edited version translated into standard English. However, when reading aloud, we substituted N-word for the offending word. The reality is that when teachers say or write N-word, students know it replaces a racially offensive term, and they don't need further explanation. Voices of the People's History of the United States, in its 2004 edition, which is edited by Howard Zinn and Anthony Arnold, has an edited version of the Ain't I a Woman speech without an explanation of why it was edited. In their text, Zinn and Arnold substituted Negroes for the N-word, which introduces a different problem. Many students think Negro is the N-word and was used as an insult. In classes, we have discussed that African Americans in different historical periods used different terms to describe themselves, and that the choices were usually related to the civil rights movement. W.E.B. Du Bois referred to people of African ancestry in the United States as colored. Martin Luther King Jr. considered himself Negroes. Black was a term of choice with the late 1960s Black Pride and Black Power movements. More recently, African American or Afro-American have been the preferred nomenclature. Some textbooks, selective quotes are used to avoid introducing the N-word as it appears in the text, but I think this whitewashes American racism. Mark Twain's The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, first published in 1884, has been a particularly troubling text to teach because Twain embeds the N-word in the name of Jim, a principal character. But Twain did this to highlight Jim's humanity and decency compared to white characters that mistreated Huck. In one edition, published in 2011, the offending word is expunged to make it more suitable for classroom. I believe students need to see and read and discuss the original and Twain's decision to use the N-word, but I would not have them read the offending word aloud. They could just read Jim. Racist images pose a different problem for teachers because when analyzing the images, you can't avoid seeing the racism, but also because the stereotypes emphasized in the images can reinforce existing student bias about particular groups. Most of you are familiar with these images, and I decided not to show them here. I always begin with a trigger warning, not so much because students will be offended, but because they should be offended by the images. Some stereotypes have lost their bite over time, like Thomas Nast portraying Irish immigrants in the United States as ape-like. But other images, Nazi propaganda's depiction of Jews, U.S. anti-Japanese propaganda during World War II, and racist portrayals of Africans and African Americans, including former President Barack Obama, are still very painful. Republican politicians have been quick to defend racist images and artists and attack those who question use of the images in classrooms. When Dr. Seuss was exposed for racist depictions of Asians and Africans early in his career, Senator Marco Rubio from Florida tweeted, quote, "When history looks back at this time, it will be held up as an example of a depraved socio-political purge driven by hysteria and lunacy," close quote. Senator Ted Cruz of Texas tweeted a photo that showed books by Dr. Seuss at the top of the bestseller list. A Republican congressman introduced the Grinch Act to safeguard the access of American children to historic stories and characters, whether they are racist or not. And House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy posted a video of himself reading Seuss's Green Eggs and Ham. Dr. Seuss, Ted Geisel, never officially apologized for racial depictions, but some commentators argue that his book, Horton Hears a Who, published in 1954, which teaches that support for the oppressed is a moral imperative, represents a rejection of earlier racist and anti-Japanese material. The book was written after Dr. Seuss visited Japan and witnessed destruction caused by the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. I think Dr. Seuss's realization is an important lesson. If teachers ignore the destruction caused by words, images, and actions by removing them from the curriculum, students won't understand how horrific they are, the pain they cause, and their impact on world events. While the N-word should remain as was written in text, or at most replaced with the N-word, I don't think teachers should say the N-word out loud in class, no matter who they are or who the students are in the room in front of them. That is a taboo that I believe needs to stand. If you are uneasy about how to address racist images and text in lessons, good policy is to establish what you plan with your supervisor and even to send a note to parents explaining what you plan to do in class. I hope this was helpful, and I hope when we return to live presentation, I get to discuss these with teachers. Thank you.